There we are. We're on. What's so funny?
You always say the funniest stuff right before you record, so we end up coming on laughing with zero context, and I can't go back and explain a moment.
It's a good cold open. You know what, I'm impressed though. That shows a lot of growth from you, because when I first met you, like 20 plus years ago, you would have been incapable of not attempting to explain the reasons why something was funny. You know what I mean? Like, wait, let me break it down, you know? So you've grown. I got a question for you to open us up. You ready?
I'm ready.
Okay. I'm curious if you can think of an example of a book that you objectively believe is a good book, but you don't actually like it.
You mean like
it's a good book, but you just don't enjoy it.
Oh yeah, it would be Time, Space, and Knowledge by Tarthing.
Wait. You can't know that's a good book without ever having read any of it. You just know from looking at it.
No, I have. It's so good that I bought the entire collection after reading that one.
Did you finish the first book though?
I bought everything that he wrote.
I know, and you told me, go buy, you didn't just say one, you said go buy all of this dude's books. And even though I should have learned by now, I did. I was like, okay, I'm doing it. And I think I picked it up and read like 2 pages and was like, this is the most brilliant stuff I've ever read. And I haven't read it since. I can't. It's physically impossible. But have you ever encountered anyone else who has read those books?
No.
How did you come across them?
I remember looking for like some commentaries on YouTube for people that would talk about them. And I think I found maybe 3 guys who had some short 5-minute videos, 1 or 2 of them. But no.
I'm convinced that your method, I don't know if it's still this way, was, I mean, I'm not just guessing, because I saw you do this in person when we would go to like a used bookstore. But I think you probably applied it to YouTube too back in the early days. You browse around looking for whoever is the weirdest, least successful at normal life looking person you can find. And you immediately want to know what they're reading. And that's what you're convinced is what you should be reading. It's it.
But then how do you explain all the ones that I found on my own?
I don't know. That's a good question.
Maybe because I simply looked in the mirror and says, what are you reading?
There are times where I have throughout the years, I like to try to imagine what you do when you're by yourself and like how you go about like choosing what to read, who to talk to. Cause you know, there's things like characters that you claim to have had tons of conversations with that nobody else has ever met that are just like too weird and unique to be real. And they only exist at like a little coffee shop at 2 a.m. with no other witnesses around. And I want to know, like, is that real? You go for walks in the middle of the night, supposedly in the middle of like the most dangerous part of town with headphones on, listening to some like weird chanting or, you know, like, I want to know, like, are you just telling me this stuff and really you're just like asleep on the couch with a bowl of like cookie dough, you know?
The moments are real. All the stories are real.
The secret life of TK Coleman. I mean, you must be doing that stuff in your spare time because then you always bring with you all this amazing insight and ideas and stuff. So like you are reading and talking to people somehow. I don't know what it is. So I'll give an answer.
Let's sit with this question. Yeah, this is
okay. No. Go ahead.
No. Okay, yeah, I want to hear your answer because I'm still trying to find the frame for it. That's such an interesting frame. A book that you objectively think is good. So the one way I can make sense of the question is like, is there some book that so many people who are credible in your eyes, not like, you know, these 100 best books kind of list, but you've had several people that are really credible tell you this is legit. You read it, you go, I don't get it, but you know what? On faith, I think that's objectively good.
Yeah, or maybe like stylistically. I'll start with a music example. So, you know, go listen to music by Wagner. And I'm like, it is not hard for me to say this is objectively good music. It's technically interesting. It was innovative at the time. It's got all kinds of layers of sound. There's a brilliance to it. I get it. I get why people say Wagner is a great composer. I don't enjoy his music. So when it comes to books, I was thinking about this because I was thinking about asking you, because I'm always so curious about, like, you like lots of things that nobody else likes. You're great at finding value out of things other people dismiss. But I was curious if the reverse has ever been true. If things that other people find valuable, you're like, well, I'm not even disagreeing with you. I just don't see it. And then I was like, is that true of me? I think For Whom the Bell Tolls, Hemingway is a great writer. I love his writing style. I think he's one of the best writers. I love reading the way he writes about writing. I think The Old Man and the Sea is a really good book. For Whom the Bell Tolls is undoubtedly a good novel, and it's well written, and I've only gotten 2/3 of the way through it, and I just don't enjoy reading it enough. I don't dislike it, but I'm just like, yeah, I get it. It's a good book. I'm going to go read something else. I don't need to finish it. But I would never argue with someone, oh, it's overrated or it's a bad book. Like, no, it's probably not overrated. It's a really good book. I just don't care enough to finish it.
I know I felt like that about some movies before, but I can't think of any examples off the top of my head, but I distinctly remember that feeling, you know, but it was more along the lines of, I'm sure this is having the impact that everybody says it has on them, but I can't make myself cry or laugh, but I get it.
Yeah. It's like, there are certain things where you disagree with people's opinions and you're willing to debate with them. Like, you know, no, there's no way LeBron James is a top 10 all-time NBA player. You're crazy if you think that. But there are other times where you're like, yeah, I'm not even going to try to debate with you. Like, I'm sure that's a great book. It's not for me, but it's great. So I was just curious about that. So
we're doing good. 10 minutes in, no NBA talk other than like side.
I just dropped something a little bit. So
but see still, how long people can get that reference. That's
okay. So I got another question for you. I got all these questions for you today. What is it like to be so prescient yet so culturally irrelevant because of your prescience?
Are you asking about me, or
I'm asking about you?
Am I this person?
Yes.
I thought this was Yay Part 2 or something. I'm like, what are we doing?
Here's what I mean. So
this is like Nathan and David. You are that man.
Nathan,
like, I think people like that are terrible. Well, you are that man.
So you are so prescient to your detriment. So look, you know how there are people who are like, they're always like a couple years ahead, or maybe even 5 years ahead. They were on to something before it was cool. If you're a couple years ahead, even up to 5 years ahead, you can still that can still work. You can still get the payoff. And then when everybody else comes around, they're like, hey, this guy was early. But if you're 10 years early, you get nothing. And I have noticed you have this pattern. You are so early on things that later become huge trends, like things that no one knows about. But by the time they become trends, you are utterly bored with them and you have moved on like 3 years ago. And so you never get like any of the credit. And you're too bored to even go back and be like, hey guys, look, there's proof that. So I can think of so many examples like this. Like, you told me about this Jordan Peterson guy, like years before he was a deal in but he hadn't gotten any of the controversy around. I don't know how you found him. He was like an obscure Canadian professor. He hadn't had any of this controversy and put in the limelight and everything. And even after that, it took like 5 years before he became as big and mainstream as he is now. But like, somehow you came across him. Conspiracy theories. Like, now it's so popular and cool. There's like, everybody's publicly talking about everything from JFK to aliens to whatever. You were like, so, and not just like casually, oh, listen to Coast AM. Like, you read everything. You knew everything, like all of it. And then you just like moved on. And then 5, 7 years after you moved on, 10 years after you moved on, slowly all these things that you were like totally mastered forever ago are like making their way in, but you don't care anymore. You've moved. NLP, like neuro linguistic programming, like human optimization, like 5 years, 10 years before Tim Ferriss or whatever these guys are, like whatever the trend is, look at any trend. And I guarantee you, TK Coleman was on that 10 years before and telling me about it. And I would like dabble a little and be like, yeah, there's something kind of interesting there, but I'm not willing. And you would just like master it and then be like playing around with it, seeing what use you could get out of it for a year or two. And then you move on. And then culture catches up like 7 years later. It just occurred to me that this pattern is so crazy. So do you?
There are like 100 new millionaires, and I don't get to be one of them.
Do you feel frustrated? Do you ever look at that and say, I was there early? Because I never see you publicly say that.
Yeah. There's only one thing I feel that way about. There's only one call that I made well in advance, and no one will ever believe me.
Here comes the NBA. Here comes the NBA.
I'm so confident you know what it is. Just tell the world. I called it.
You called LeBron James going back to Cleveland, like barely after he went to Miami. It was like a year or two in, maybe.
No, it wasn't even that far.
I don't even think of it that far. I think it was like like during his first season in Miami. I think you called him returning to Cleveland, and you're like, hey, they're getting some draft picks. They're good, and you called it like consistently for like a couple years, and I truly, because I don't know if this is a blind squirrel thing, though. You know what I mean? Or like a broken clock is right twice a day. Because you made a lot of NBA calls. But here's the thing. That one was so great and so unlikely. And it was literally years before anyone else even had that as a thought, that I have no option but to say, this dude is brilliant. He's a prophet.
What's great about that call is it's literally based on just the logic and the arguments, the most obvious, unimpressive call I've ever made. But I took so much heat for it. Everybody dismissed me as a complete fool. And it's the most unimpressive prediction I ever made. It's just like, here's a guy who leaves a team. They have no stars on that team. It's a completely crappy team. What's going to happen? They're going to go to the bottom, and they're going to be in the top 5 for draft picks for what? The next 4 years. What's this guy's contract in the new place? 4 years. So in 4 years, this team is going to be perfectly positioned, if they do well in the draft, to have really good talent, but they'll still need an alpha dog. And it would just be the best timing for him to come back.
Here's where your genius is.
And be able to take the credit for that, getting them to the next level.
Here's where your genius is. Everyone else was so stuck looking at the emotions of the moment, where all the Cleveland fans were burning his jersey because of the way that he lied to them and did his big show of leaving and putting curses on him, and they all hated him. And he goes to Miami and immediately is like, not 6, not 7, not 8, sending the signal that like, this is a decade-long super team. Like, okay, they don't want me anymore in Cleveland. I don't want them anymore. I'm all in on Miami, baby. This is the new life. I'm here with my boys. We're going to, and they were trying to get Chris Paul on that team as well. And there was like, you're like, this dude, this is it. This is it. Miami is the new cool thing. LeBron's going to do it. But you saw something. You understood his ethic better than anyone else. Shout out Patrice O'Neal. LeBron can't change his ethic. You understood that underneath all that bluster, you understood both him and the city of Cleveland. They are, if we're going to just collectivize the entire city of Cleveland, they are both super insecure and really, really want to be loved. And Cleveland, you knew those fans would immediately welcome him back and apologize for burning his jerseys. And you knew that he desperately wanted Cleveland to love him. And that hurt him so bad that they didn't love him. He pretended like he was tough and he didn't care. But he wanted that more than he wanted rings in Miami. And I don't think anybody realized that. We took it at face value, but you were like, I know this. I know this guy. I know his ethic.
Hey, by the way, man, the time is right and ready. I don't know his contract situation, but the time is right and ready for a closing act part 2, which might be as good, if not better, than the first.
Come on. Back to Cleveland?
Yeah. Again, I don't know his contract.
The problem now, though, is he needed it to look like he saved them. Now they're the best team in the NBA, and he's old and it will look like he's going and trying to, take credit.
So let me make the case. You need a few conditions to be obtained first, but let me make the case. This was also true of the Toronto Raptors in the regular season for many years, right? And it got to the point where the Raptors winning 50 games and being the number 1 seed in the East became kind of like a meme to everyone outside of Toronto, where that your team doesn't have to be scared of the Raptors in a 7-game series. They're not going to the finals, and they're not winning.
You kept calling them to win every year after year.
I never lost faith.
You still believe that Kyle Lowry is a top 3 player in the NBA.
I was like the persistent widow. I just kept knocking. I was like, we're gonna get that championship. I was never wrong.
So mad right when KD goes down, Clay goes down, the Warriors' entire bench was gutted, and I'm like, crap. Toronto's actually going to win after 10 years in a row of TK predicting them to win. He's going to be like, see, I told you.
Hey, sometimes you're not wrong. You're just late. But look, okay, Toronto's my example, right? Their lack of playoff credibility kind of created the perception that, they're a good team, especially for the regular season, but they don't have an alpha dog, so they're never going to make it. And then when Kawhi goes over there just in time, it's sort of like they're really the perfectly constructed team if you can just add a guy that can go get you a bucket at the end of the game. And Kawhi was that guy, and he did it for them. Cleveland right now is the number 1 seed, and everyone's respecting them because they haven't been that before, apart from LeBron. And so right now that's exciting. It's just like OKC. OKC fell short last year in spite of having all that talk around them. They've got to do it this year. If OKC just falls short and gets eliminated in the second round or something like that, people aren't going to take them seriously. They'll just be like, great regular season team. And you already hear kind of like that talk. They've got something to prove. So let's say Cleveland gets knocked out by Boston and they prove themselves to be a solid team, but they're not the beast in the East. They haven't proven themselves in the playoffs. LeBron could go there and get that credit for getting them over the hump. Now, if the Cavs make it to the finals, then that's different, right? But if they don't make it to the finals, especially if they do that 2 years in a row, again, I don't know his contract situation, the time would be right for him to go back over there and then get one with them. And then he retires, rides off into the sunset. Grand opening, grand closing.
How does he convince them to bring Bronny James over?
Based on skill. Bronny sells himself. I've sent you, I don't know how many highlight clips I need to send you of Bronny scoring like 6 points in 2 minutes before you start to believe.
Dude, I saw, oh man, sports media, the NBA is so fake. It's so WWE. I saw like all over Twitter, LeBron James claps back at Stephen A. Smith for insulting Bronny or whatever. Apparently, like on the floor, on the court of the last game last night or something, LeBron James, there's video of him yelling in Stephen A. Smith's face about keep my son out of this or whatever, because Stephen A. criticized him, saying he's not that good. He's not that good, right? So then Stephen A. tweets, I didn't want to have to do this, but since you all are forcing me to, I'm going to have to address this situation with me and LeBron today at 10:30 a.m. on first day. And you're like, oh, he was forced. His hand was forced. I didn't want to have to spend all day talking about me and LeBron fighting, but I guess I have to.
Dude, okay, so that brings me to beyond sports. Let's talk about the future of YouTube and content creation. Both of us are definitely not in that camp of going around saying, the world doesn't need another blog or another podcast. We have enough noise. You and I approach this stuff from a kind of personal development, self-actualizing point of view, where it's like there's something about showing up and creating something every day or very often, even if it's not that good, that changes who you are as a person. And that teaches you things in a way that you couldn't learn otherwise. So I'm never going to be on that train that says, if you want to start a podcast, the world doesn't need more noise. Start your podcast, even if it stinks. Go for something. Go for something different. It's going to make you better. What I'm thinking about is how the economic incentives of what it takes to make money on social media, like YouTube, like X, how that's changing the content game and what that looks like in the future for learners and for thinkers who want to find the best kind of stuff so that they can grow. What I'm seeing now is the algorithms are rewarding frequency, which is not intrinsically a problem, but it's one of the things that AI can compete with so much better. Like one of the things that AI can do so much better. It may not be able to compete at the level of quality, but at the level of frequency, you can do one video a day, AI can give you 20 a day. You can do one blog post a day, AI can give you 50 blog posts a day. And that kind of raises the bar, right? And so one of the things you see on YouTube is like, all right, if you're not posting every day or maybe multiple times a day, you're not really showing up in people's feed, you're not getting the promotion. And so now we're seeing something that I never saw. I didn't even see this like 5 years ago very much, is the emergence and prominence of the reaction video, where all of your favorite thinkers are kind of being pressured, so to speak, to do reaction videos. So that now, pick your industry. It can be religion, it can be politics, it can be sports. All you need is one guy to say something stupid, or one guy to make some mistake, or just speak too fast, or embarrass himself in a debate. And all your favorite thinkers are going to have a video about that moment. And it's everybody. It's like, hey, my reaction to this guy saying something goofy in a debate. My reaction to this guy saying something stupid at a press conference. I'm curious your take on that. Not from like a self-righteous point of view of like, glad I'm not doing that. But how is that changing things in the world of content creation, especially for content consumers?
Well, the first thing that it's going to change is you just gave me a brilliant idea. After this episode, we got to release an episode where it's my face and your face in a small box to the corner watching this episode, and we're reacting to our own moments of our own podcast. And then after that one, we'll do a reaction to the episode. Think about how meta that can get, right? Like, oh, see right there how you laughed when I said that? Yeah, you know what I was thinking? We'll just break down and just become so self-referential. No, that's a joke, but there's actually something kind of interesting in there in terms of things that reference things, and you get this stack. And in its best version, that stack is just part of culture, right? You look at like meme culture. If you just come in cold, you have no idea what's going on, because all memes are references to previous generations of memes, which are references to other things, and you get this stack. And that's how slang works and all of these. And that's okay. It's part of the evolution, the cultural context. And that's why cultures that live separated from each other, give them enough time and they literally don't understand each other anymore, because everything is a reference back to something else, right? So it doesn't have to be a bad thing, but there's also a weird information quality question of, if everything is a reaction to something previously created, then pretty soon your reactions are reactions to reactions, and you're not getting any fresh inputs in the system. Now, I don't think we're at that spot now, but now you throw in the AI component, and I like to call it like the Ouroboros problem, right? The snake eating its tail. If the AI is generating tons of stuff, but it's generating it based on inputs from things that were generated previously, and the AI generated stuff is outpacing human generated stuff, then suddenly all of its inputs are AI generated. And so all the inputs are amalgams of other amalgams of other amalgams of previous creations by humans. You get a degradation in the originality and in the quality, and it starts to get into like a doom loop where it ends up being like low quality, meaningless. So there's that question, but ultimately I don't think any of this stuff is really that like big of a deal. Like, we're in a moment where that's a hot trend, all the reactions and the frequency of videos. The market will adapt, like zig when everybody else zags, and not like you where you're 10 years too early, but just like 1 or 2 years too early. Like, now stop worrying about frequency and reactions and relevancy and all that kind of stuff, and just go deep on what you love and do quality and do it on your own pace. And in a year or two, you'll have this body of work when the mass pendulum has swung back because everyone's so exhausted and overwhelmed by all this crap at high frequency, that it's a high likelihood those things will get rewarded. Like, I mean, you saw that with, even in the podcast world, you saw podcasts came out at first and they were just sort of awkward. Like, people didn't really know what to do. So they put their radio show on a podcast. And then they kind of got into a groove where they were like an hour-ish long convos. And then people were like, well, people are on the go. Society's moving faster. We got to make them shorter. You have like 30-minute, 20-minute. And Joe Rogan's like, no, I'm just going to sit in a basement and smoke a cigar and talk for 3.5 hours. Totally rambly. And it just took over and blew up. And it was like, oh, that was like people don't remember. That was a total zag when everybody else was going this way. And now it's like a very common thing to have 2-3 hour conversations, these long form. So I think things correct. I think they go back and forth, but I rambled too long because I remember you told me something on the phone a little while ago. You said you think podcasting is dead, and you are like a professional podcaster. That's your gig. So you got to give me, I actually don't think that. I think podcasting has a long way to go up and to the right, but I'm curious what you mean by that.
Yeah. Well, it's dead in the same way that the newspaper is dead, the magazine is dead, and radio is dead. They are still alive, but now they have found their sensible place in the world of content, and all of the illusions and delusions that were created by the trend of this being the number one thing that people want. All of that has kind of faded away. So an example of that would be, in the earliest days of podcasting, it actually wasn't the case that you had a plethora of examples of people that were making, 20 grand a week or a month doing podcasts. No one had figured that out yet. The Mr. Beast model of podcasting was not even a thing. It was more of people with products they were selling, organizations they were promoting, missions they were raising funds for, or just philosophies that they espoused or wanted to explore, having conversations. And you always had your outliers, your people that were making a lot of money from their blogs or making some money from podcasting. But it wasn't seen in the earliest days as like, oh, you can go be a professional podcaster. It was more like, hey, entrepreneur, if you're building something, you can't afford to ignore this world. You now have the power to platform your ideas and let people know about your mission and let them know who you are as a person. Then there kind of came this tipping point where it's like, we figured something out. We figured it out. We figured how to create certain kinds of content at a large enough frequency, how to build our audience, how to build our brand. And now we can make a ton of money to this. And there was this window of opportunity that opened up. And it's like, yo, you can make twice as much as being a school teacher by running a podcast, posting a few times a week. If you follow these steps and you've got courses on it, you've got blog posts about it, people are flooding into the game like the earliest days of real estate, right? Where now everybody and their mom is all about investing in real estate. And that's never going to die. But that doesn't mean it's always going to be at the top of the pop charts, right? Like jazz isn't dead, but jazz is never going to be at the top of the pop charts, right? It is where it is. It has its place, and that's where it's going to be. In a similar way, I think now we're at a point where there's been so much podcast burnout, where people are starting to experience how the social media sites don't want to be gamified, and it's more profitable for them if you don't figure them out and if you don't have a sustainable path for making money. And so once they see people have figured out, follow these steps and you make money, they'll let you do that for 3 to 6 months, but then they want to switch it up because it's more profitable. And then you got to figure it out again. And that's creating a lot of this tension and so on. And I think we're now at a place where there will always be people who make money doing this, but now it's beginning to stabilize. And we're starting to see a slow but gradual return to people embracing the world of podcasting as a place to explore ideas, to develop their skills, or to build a body of work for something else that they want to do, or as a tool that complements what they want to do. Which is why I really like your consistently held position through all of this. At no point did you try to jump on the train and say, oh, I can make my full-time living on a podcast. At no point did you do that. Not that it would have been wrong or that there's anything bad about that, but you've always used it as a value creation tool that said, look, I can have an interesting conversation that can make a difference in somebody's life. Or here's a guy that's doing interesting work. I want people to know about his ideas. Or here's something that I'm building. It's right here in front of me. Why don't I use this as a platform to tell the world? I think we're coming back to that in a more elevated, professional, aesthetically pleasing sense.
Yeah, I don't disagree with any of that. I think there's some interesting. Okay, so if I ever talk about data, it's probably wrong, and I'm probably just making it up. So don't ever check me on it. But I'm somewhat confident, because I remember looking at some of this before, that the number of podcasts that do more than like 10 episodes or that continue for longer than like a year or two, that really hasn't moved that much. So you have a huge increase in the ones that start something and don't stick with it, but you still kind of have this core. And I still think it's underexploited. Like the whole 1,000 true fans thing, people still don't appreciate how powerful that is. Cause I mean, I can think off the top of my head, half a dozen people I know that started a podcast in the last 24 months. And within 24 months got it to where it's making them enough to live on. Because it's in a niche. It's in a niche that will never be a household name. But if you got 1,000 people that are like, I'll pay you $10 a month. You're bringing in $120K a year. And maybe that's what you were making at your job. And that's surprising how many niches there are where people really want you to go deep into their nerd niche. I mean, like there's a podcast that is literally only about how J.R.R. Tolkien's work relates to Orthodox Christianity. Like Orthodox Christianity is the smallest branch of Christianity in the US, and only those Orthodox Christians who are big nerds on Tolkien, right? Like that's a podcast, and it's like they do like really in-depth stuff. It's really devoted. I don't know if they're making money or whatever, but like I think there's a lot more room than people think for those, but just like starting another hot takes on the news or pop culture podcast, I think those have reached their kind of like equilibrium, you know?
Yeah. And that's maybe another element that I didn't quite capture, but I think you're right about. And it is the death to podcasting, just like the death to magazines. You can walk into a Barnes and Noble and see a whole magazine section, and that ain't going anywhere.
Yeah. In fact, in little niches, magazines are making a comeback for people who are like, they got a subscriber base of 500 or 5,000, and that's all they want it to be.
Yeah, exactly. I think what's dying is maybe the model of, hey, general podcasts, general guests, general conversation. Let's talk to successful people, great accomplishers, great achievers, and we're going to talk about their secrets to success. I think if you're copying Tim Ferriss, your time has probably passed.
I mean, his time has passed. He still has a huge legacy audience with him, but like, he's kind of not really in the hip. You know what I mean? Like he's a little bit boring at this point, right? Like,
he's now moved into that niche category, arguably, right? Where there's a strong, loyal audience who listens because of the way he conducts a conversation. And you can build it around a personality. I guess the Oprah model, or what is now the Joe Rogan model, that's more alive than ever before. If you are an interesting person and people like the way you do conversation, you've got a whole life ahead of you. But yeah, if anybody out there is thinking about starting one, I'm all for it. Even if I was convinced that there is no way to make money podcasting, I would be okay and excited about every single person in the universe having a podcast. I think that'd be ultimately a net positive still.
One of the funny things two thoughts. One, a little aside. Everything that we've been talking about is true in the sort of mass consumer facing world. In the B2B industry, like especially tech businesses that are selling to other businesses, podcasts are still dramatically underexploited. Like it's crazy to think this. I know this though, because my previous company, we spun one up. Didn't take very long to become the top one in that small niche of B2B audience. And that audience was a buyer of a certain type of software that's worth 15 to 30 grand a year to the people who sell it. So those sellers, even if you have 1,000 listeners times $30,000 of potential buying power, that's a $30 million market right there. Like, it's crazy how there's some of these, again, it's niches, but I think in the business world, especially like in small niches of business, if you have a podcast that's all about running actuarial software and maximizing your data integrity for being an actuary, I don't know if that's how big that market is, but I bet there is one. And if you are an actuary, you're like, there's a podcast for me. Wow, I didn't know that, right? It's probably the only one. And that market is probably got a several $1 million value to it. So like, there are a lot of unexplored corners, but
and by the way, man, imagine having a podcast. It's like your favorite niche, something that you're interested in, and you don't have a ton of people in your life that are interested in talking to you about that. And you got 100 people that show up every week to engage you on that. That's crazy.
That's what's crazy too. And the people you can get as guests, if you're in a small enough niche, if you have a hobby that's pretty narrow, like let's say you're into lock picking. I think of this because my buddy Chuck Grimmett gave me this book one time, Burglar's Guide to the City, which is an amazing book. But it has a little section about lock picking, and like there's these whole subculture of like lock picking clubs. People get together to practice how to pick this type of lock, and this is like this whole weird subculture. Imagine if you're into that. If you decide to launch a lock picking podcast, immediately you will probably get a yes from the biggest names in the lock picking community when you ask them to come on for an interview, right? Like, but if you're just a hobbyist who's like, I'm just a fan of lock picking, those people won't go to lunch with you. They won't reply to your emails. But if you have a podcast, so like even as a personal friendship thing, this is what's so funny. Whenever one of my friends or acquaintances launches a podcast, I love it because they usually invite me on, and I don't care if anybody ever listens to it. I'm like, there wouldn't be very many other contexts where I would talk to this person for an hour, but this like something about having it inside the frame of a podcast makes it really fun and interesting. Like I just talked to my old friend, Nicole, who lives in Tennessee. She runs like a how to run a homestead and farm in Tennessee podcast. I wouldn't like get on the phone and just talk to her for an hour, but she asked if I want to come on the podcast and talk about my experience living in Tennessee. And then when I moved away from Tennessee and why, and what were the pros and cons. And we had a blast. That would only happen because of her podcast, right? So like, it's this weird, also like extra surface area that allows you to have different kinds of friendships and conversations, regardless of the listenership. So like, anyway, I'm still bullish on it on the individual and niche level, but I think I agree with you that like at a like mass market peak, it's probably not ascending in influence.
And last comment on this, there's a stage, I don't know the word for this, where every trend as it's going upward, there's this stage where you can just kind of like throw money at it and have a decent chance of cashing in. You don't have to know anything about it. You don't have to care. You don't have to be super intentional. It's like, yo, just move fast, break things. You'll come out with something good from it. And I think we're done with that.
Yep.
I think that's the stage that's dead.
Yep. It's funny, by the way, if you have ever caught or even partially caught one of those moments where you get the timing right. And I've never had on like some massive level where I'm just like raking in millions of dollars because I timed something, but I've had a few little tastes. Like when we first launched Praxis, I remember with Facebook, or actually even before Praxis, probably 2008, 9, early Facebook, when I was running Students for a Free Economy, I would go on Facebook, and if I paid like literally $20 for Facebook ads, I could get like 200 people to RSVP for an in-person event, and 150 of them would show up. Like, it was so insane, the ROI. And then I remember when Medium first launched. You remember Medium?
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
And I was like, oh, I was like a really early user. I'm going to just post an article. I was already writing blog posts. I'm just going to post one to Medium once a week. And literally every time I posted one, it wasn't the numbers that I get, but it was who. I would get like journalists, venture capitalists, other entrepreneurs. It'd have like 50 views, and I'd get 6 emails from like really, really high value people every time being like, hey, we should talk. Hey, we should partner. Hey, are you trying to raise capital? Hey, you should come on my show and let me interview you. Because it was like, at that moment, it was the it thing, and like really influential people. So like I've seen these moments. Quora had this moment where if you were answering questions on Quora, you could get like millions of impressions and followers our Derek McGill, who worked with us, was doing that. And like, so I've kind of been like on the outskirts of that, and it is wild, but it is so out of your control in some ways.
Yeah.
That like, I almost don't like that feeling. I'm like, okay, well, I'm getting results, but it's not because of anything that I'm doing differently. It's like luck. I can't rely on that. It's fickle, and I don't want to become a slave to it. And when it starts dwindling, I don't want to panic and be like, how do I need to change my game to keep winning the algorithm battle? You know?
Yeah. And so that is an interesting question that you and Cyprian discussed, which is the content creating you, or are you creating the content? You didn't word it that way, but it's like, at what point?
Dude, you always boil things down to the most concise wording ever. I like that.
That's a good compliment for someone who is the complete opposite of concise in every other conversation we have.
This is what's funny. You and I are the opposite in this way. This just occurred to me. In the spoken word, when I try to define something, I ramble and ramble and ramble, and I can't boil it down. In the written word, I am very good at being very concise. I can put it in a 140 character tweet. You are kind of the opposite. Like when you go to write something, like if I ask you a quick question in like a text or whatever, it's like voice memo, right? But in the spoken word, you'll just be like, you'll look at the ceiling for 3 seconds and then you'll put it in like 7 words. It's amazing. Our powers combined, we'd be unstoppable.
We'd be unstoppable, man. Unlimited. You and
I interrupted you though. You were saying something.
No, there's this interesting question of, hey, at what point am I showing up every week because I have a show and that's what shows do, versus I'm showing up every week because I have something to say and I'm still within the time frame of wanting to say it. Because you've got people like Dave Ramsey, for instance, who I think that man wants to show up every day and do 5 to 6 hours of radio every day until the day he dies or is physically unable to do so.
There is nothing fake about him talking about managing your personal finances all day, every day. And that's like inside him and wants to come out like endlessly. Yeah.
Yeah. He's like Kobe with playing basketball. Like, I'm never stopping. I will have to be stopped by nature. Right. But then you have, for a lot of podcasts, a lot of shows, there's kind of a shelf life, whether you talk about it or not. You know it's not going to go on forever. And you know you don't even want to talk about that forever. But maybe you got a little success. Maybe it's answering some important financial questions. Maybe you're doing well. And maybe you know that you have enough of a legacy to where you can show up, even kind of mail it in, and there's a certain baseline you'll always be able to achieve. At what point are you driving that content? Or is the need to have content? Or is the fact that you have a slot assigned to you driving you to create it? And I don't know if that's an easy question to answer. You know, it requires some radical self-honesty, you know?
And I think we have to be really careful in answering that question, really humble about not assuming we know the answer for other people and being really judgmental about it. Because right, it's so easy to be like, oh yeah, they're faking it, they're selling it. But you know, you and I doing this podcast, why are we doing it? Is there some impure motive involved? Is it for pure motive? Like, I don't know. I want to do it. It sounds fun. Is there some part of me that's like driven by ego and I don't know, maybe. Is there some like, at some level, you can't, you know, you get too in the weeds worrying about that, and especially trying to decide it for somebody else. Okay, but I had to ask. I don't know if you guys get this question ever. But this here's the elephants in the room. Yeah. So you're a co-host of the Minimalist podcast.
Yeah.
And the concept of minimalism, right, is like, do away with anything you don't absolutely need. Now, maybe that's a horrible definition. You guys probably have reasons for not liking that. But, you know, when I hear it, I'm like, okay, if you can get away with less, get away with less. If you don't need it, get rid of it, right? I'm curious if people say to you, how can there be a podcast called The Minimalist that's been going for like 10, I don't know how many seasons it's been going, but a lot of seasons, right? Like, is there a contradiction? Would you know when you're like, that's enough? I'm just curious. And I don't say that at all as like I got you, or I'm not proving it. Because to me, it's like, you know, it's like my wife saying, you know, she's never going to say, well, you already told me you love me. So we don't have to keep having the same conversation, right? So like, even if you're having the same conversation, it's new listeners. They want to ask the same questions. You want to have the same conversation. I'm not saying there's nothing to it, but I'm curious just from you as a host, do you ever feel this pressure where you're like, it's about minimalism? Do we ever have like a danger of saying too much about the concept of doing and saying less?
Yeah. So it's funny. So that question comes in every week.
This shows that I don't listen to your show enough.
but hardly ever as a question, usually as a calling out of a contradiction. You know, the show's called The Minimalist, and you just added another host. This show is called The Minimalist, and you guys live in California, the most expensive state in the U.S. This show is called The Minimalist.
Look, you know, I'm going to throw one in the mix. This show is called The Minimalist, and one of your hosts takes the most luggage with him when he travels for a 2-day trip of anyone I've ever met.
That's great. That's great. Yeah. So it usually comes out as like sort of like a call out to contradiction. And I would approach that question by saying there is an understanding of minimalism that's a lot like Spartanism, where there's almost like minimalism as a personal challenge to see how ascetic I can be. And there are people who live that way. And in fact, I would say that my co-host, Joshua Fields Milburn, is probably the most invulnerable to any charges of hypocrite when it comes to that kind of stuff, because his ability to live without is just absolutely phenomenal. And the level of simplicity that he has, and he's also OCD as well, with the level of neatness and simplicity that he desires, that the only thing that holds him back from going even further is that he has family.
Dude, I have met this dude, and I would be like scared to offer him something for fear of offending him, that, you know, I would try to present him with a physical object that might clutter his life. No, he's an awesome dude, but I totally doesn't surprise me. He seems like this truly is who he is to like a radical extent.
Yeah, and he doesn't take free samples or free anything, because he says nothing is more costly than something someone is trying to give me for free.
Dude, I love it.
And he doesn't believe in buying anything on sale unless he really needs it. He calls a sale a fool's tax. It's the price you pay for being able to be tricked into buying something that you wouldn't pay full price for.
TK, I think I've like unknowingly been a minimalist all this time, at least in some sense. Over my 21 years of marriage, the number of times my wife has been like, can you believe how much of a sale this was on? I'm like, but it's not a sale if you didn't need it in the first place. We weren't planning on buying it. So like, it was 20 instead of 60. You didn't save 40, you wasted 20. And no matter, like, we fight over this all the time. So
yeah, he says everything's 100% off if you don't buy it.
yes. I might need a therapy session with him.
Yeah. So,
but you're not that extreme. And,
no,
and I would say, and I'm not saying that as a call out, you are in no way hypocritical to the ethos of what your show is all about. So I'm curious how you describe what is the essential of minimalism if it's not just that.
Yeah. And so if I felt like that I had to buy into that conception of minimalism, and that I had to use my voice to advocate for that conception of minimalism, you can be sure I would have never joined this show, because that's not what's interesting to me. That's not what's important to me. And while I appreciate minimalism as a philosophy of design, minimalism as an aesthetic, and even minimalism as a personal challenge to myself in terms of how much can I live with less, I see minimalism in two ways. One, I see it as the strategic leveraging of simplicity for the purpose of creating space for what matters most. In every pursuit of success, in every pursuit of wholeness, in every pursuit of the things that really matter to you, you have to be honest with yourself about the sacrifices you're willing to take on and the things that you're willing to give up in order to have them. An example of my own life of something that makes me a minimalist externally, but that's unimportant to me, but I had to choose minimalism internally in order to get it. My wife and I live in a 400 square foot apartment. We had to give up so much stuff in order to move in that place. Externally, That would impress a lot of people who subscribe to minimalism in that sense that you're talking about. But that's just a matter of luck. I'm not in that place because I'm committed to a philosophy of minimalism. I'm in that place because I prayed really hard to be in a living space that was right next to our parish, because my wife and I are so involved in parish life, and that's our number one priority.
Because
And
you want to go to your parish literally every single day, which is like a luxurious, like on its surface, you could see that as non-minimalist. Well, what's the minimum version of faithfulness you need to your church? Maybe it's attending once a week. Maybe it's whatever. You're like, no, I want more than that. I want to go every single day. Right. Like, that's interesting. Continue.
And I want to be able to go to mass every day. I want to be able to go in there and pray every day by myself. I want to be able to do all these different things. And it just so happened that the parish we fall in love with happens to be in one of the more expensive parts of California. So now I've got these really expensive tastes. I don't like it because it's expensive, but what I happen to like and where I feel called to go happens to be expensive. And so it turns out that an opportunity opens up, an opportunity which felt and seemed pretty improbable, to live in a location that is so ideal for us. But in order to say yes to it, we had to look at a whole bunch of stuff, a whole bunch of books, a whole bunch of different things, and say, are we willing to move into a place where these things can't come with us? And I actually felt like through the experience, God was saying to me, what are you willing to let go of in order to experience the answer to your prayers?
God told you the only 3 books you could bring with you were the Tarthang Tulku books that you'll never read.
And so this is an example that captures the heart of minimalism for me. It's recognizing that it's pushing back on all the consumeristic messages that tells you, here's what you got to have to be somebody. Here's what you got to have to be significant, or whatever it may be. And it's saying, look, what matters to me, right? And then once you say yes to that, it's like your old blog post back in the day where you said, do you want to do what you love, or do you want to have it easy? Because once you say yes to what you love, now it gets really hard, because you can no longer live in a world of illusions. You got to start saying no to some stuff. You got to start giving up some stuff, taking on some crosses and making some sacrifices. And so minimalism is about being willing to live with that question. How might my life be more with less? What role does simplicity and sacrifice play in my pursuit of the good life? Because we all, as early as, age 6, can think of how we can be happier with more. If I only have more friends, if I only have more help, if I only have more luck, if I only have more looks, more opportunity, that's easy. That doesn't take any intelligence to think about how much happier you would be with more. But what's really hard and requires real self-honesty is asking yourself, how might my life be more with less? And so that's how I like to approach it. And what's really fun for me is that when we take questions from our audience, and I think this understanding of minimalism is continually validated, people come to us because they want to declutter their garage. They want to figure out what to do with some family heirloom that they don't value, but it's got a lot of, sentimental value, and they feel, guilty about throwing it away. It's all that outer stuff. But then the moment they're done with that, they realize, oh, it wasn't even about that at all. Or even in the process of letting that go, they realize it's not about that at all. It's about the story that I'm telling myself. It's about the way that I feel about my mother. It's about the things that I didn't say. It's about the way in which I think I failed as a parent. And then you start unpacking and you realize, oh, it's about emotional clutter. It's about relationship clutter. It's about financial clutter. It's about all these other things. And so that's kind of the emphasis that I bring to the show. And that's the part of minimalism that I'm most preoccupied with. And last point on this is we actually get a lot of questions like what you're asking, but in a different sort of way. We get a lot of people that are simplifying their lives who call in feeling like, I don't know if I'm minimalist enough. And because of this way of seeing, I get the opportunity to sort of help them see that this ain't a religion. And this isn't something that you ever need to call yourself. And you never need to worry about someone else's label for you. Like if there are people out there that say, no, I'm a real minimalist and you're not a good minimalist because I see 3 bookshelves. Who cares? Do you want those books? Are you actually going to use them to create value in your life or someone else's? Well, then go for it. Let them have the label. Let simplicity serve you, not the other way around.
So carrying your cross for a minimalist would be like wearing a glitter covered pink boa. Be an extra. You're an extra minimalist. Look,
You just turned me into Dion.
Look, dude, that explanation of minimalism was so much more in depth. I all this time just suspected that minimalism was your philosophical justification for inevitably ending up homeless, because your arc, I feel like your arc was always like come right up to the point of being a multi-millionaire. And instead of just saying, yeah, give me that, you're like, no, I want to keep pursuing weird stuff, which would inevitably lead to homelessness. But now you finally have the philosophical packaging to justify living on a park bench. You know what I mean? It's perfect for you.
That's awesome.
So we've got, I mean, the Orthodox Church has Maximus the Confessor. You got to be like Minimus the Confessor, you know?
Minimus the lesser.
Yeah, I was going to say Minimus the regressor. I don't know. So actually, it's a stretch to call this a transition, but I'm going to do it anyway because it's cheesy since we were talking about religion. And something else I want to ask you about, because I've been okay. There's two ways I could go. I'm trying to decide which topic I want to go to: the rich young ruler conversation or the meaning search and explosion of interest in Christianity conversation. We'll go number two. Does that work?
Yeah, that works.
Okay. So there's this pretty well established. I don't think there's anybody that at least I know who hasn't seen or felt this in some way, a resurgence or an emergence of interest in Christianity. A lot of churches are growing, especially the more traditional forms like Catholicism and Orthodoxy, or very, very like the more stringent and traditional types of Protestantism. If not that, at least interest in religion. If not that, at least not hostility to religion. If not that, at least a move away from pure atheism and materialism and an acknowledgement of some need for some higher things or a possibility of spiritual entities.
Can I throw in another category?
Yeah, go for it.
And there's also this weird category for guys like you and I who've come up in the church, and that is people that are coming to Christianity not through any of the traditional channels. So we're not talking about Protestants going Orthodox or Catholic, or Catholics going Protestant, like moving around within, the existing forms. There are some people who are like hearing about Christianity, thinking to themselves, oh, Jesus is kind of interesting. And then they pick up a Bible for themselves and they read, and they decide things like, yeah, I don't really agree with the Apostle Paul or his writings, but, I think the Gospels are pretty cool. Or, I don't really agree with anything that James says. And I think Matthew is pretty cool. And from a paradigm of anyone that's grown up in church, you can't do that. You don't just pick up the Bible and decide. You can disagree with popular interpretations of these books, but you don't get to just say, oh yeah, I don't agree with Paul. But they're not playing by those rules. They're just coming in with a general interest in Jesus, and they say, yeah, I think I'm Christian. They didn't say the sinner's prayer, they didn't get baptized, but they just sort of have a sense of like, yeah, Jesus makes sense. And I'm looking at the culture, and this seems to be the worldview that makes sense of the culture.
And from everywhere, from the most unlikely places. Like, I have talked with people that I've known for years who are like, as far as I've known them, very, very intense atheists who have always made fun of religion, or like very, very left-wing, very right-wing, or maybe they're homosexual, or maybe they're like, and all of a sudden I will just overhear them in conversation saying as if it's no big deal. Like, oh yeah, I've been reading the Bible a lot lately. And I'm like, and I'll say, oh, what book? And it's usually Revelation. It's like, let's go right to the most confusing, crazy, hardest to understand without context. Yeah. And it leaves me like, what is drawing them to that? What are they getting from reading the book of Revelation as someone who has only ever seen everything wrong with Christianity and been philosophically opposed and ethically opposed to the belief in the existence of God and all these other things? But there's something really interesting happening cultural, like just across the entire culture, at least American culture. And I don't know what it's like in other parts of the world, but, and it's led to a lot of interesting conversations as churches are growing in number and a lot of new types of people are coming in. And then you have this sort of like Christian influencer or Christian adjacent influencer, right? So you have the explosion of a lot of podcasts, YouTube, social media accounts of Christians of various stripes, as well as people like Jordan Peterson, who are constantly talking about the value of Christianity as a set of beliefs and rituals that are beneficial to culture in sort of a utilitarian way or a psychological way. But it's certainly not like fully within any of the Christian traditions or within the church, and not like, hey, I am a Christian. So you have this whole spread.
You got like Logan Paul, or is it, I don't know if it's Logan or Jake, but you got him just being like, hey, I'm interested in this. I'll take some Christians on here.
It's crazy. Russell Brand is like, I'm a Christian now, and now I'm baptizing people. Like, I became a Christian, and then a week later I baptized people, and then all these Christians are like, what do we do about this? Should we stop him? Should we encourage him? You've got crazy, like, dirty joke comedians who have conspiracy theory podcasts, like Sam Tripoli. He's like, oh, I'm a Christian. And then like on his podcast, he's talking about how he's a Christian now. And then all the advertisements are for like, you know, boner pills and stuff, where you're just like this contrast. It's like crass, like potty humor and conspiracy theories. And he's just like, yeah, I'm a Christian. I'm reading the Bible with my buddies and trying to understand it. And it's this crazy thing I never would have envisioned 5-10 years ago, certainly not 20 years ago. So my question to you is, I've been thinking about, because there's a lot of sort of Christians who are, you know, who have been in the church for longer, like, what do we do? Do you go and find all of the, like, because there's a lot of grift and a lot of fakeness and a lot of people who are riding this, or a lot of people who are trying to use it to say like, Christianity, the Crusades, let's go like on a culture war against heathens, right? And all these things that are definitely bad, not good things. But it's such a nascent movement that, like, do you call those out and spend all your energy saying like, be careful, this is fake, that guy's not a real Christian, that guy's or do you, I don't know, I keep thinking of the parable of the wheat and the tares, where you've got the wheat and the weeds, and they're growing together, and the weeds are wrapping around the wheat and they're kind of choking some of them out, and they're causing problems. But Jesus says it would be more damaging to try to pull out the weeds now than to wait until the harvest time. Let everything become fully grown. Then we'll harvest the wheat, and then we'll burn all the tares. And I kind of just have this sense of like, now is not the time to purge and call out and go on a patrol of being like, hey, we're in this cultural moment. Let me just warn you of all the bad things and of all the people that might be phonies. And let me give you litmus tests for who's a real Christian and who's just doing it to get attention. I kind of have this feeling like, no, you'll kill the wheat too. Like, let the tares grow among the wheat. I don't know. So I don't have any specific question on that, but I want to know like your sense, and maybe you've even seen this at the Minimalist. Like, do you have an increase in people who are suddenly asking religious and spiritual questions?
Yes, actually. So at the very last Sunday symposium that we did once a month on the last Sunday of every month, we do live shows, and we took the show to Orange County, and we had someone right there in the audience say, hey, I grew up Catholic, and I'm just curious you guys' take on religion. And, I don't want to be, this person that's really dogmatic in how I approach things and treat other people. So what are some of your thoughts about religious beliefs and dogma? It's just like right there, right? It's there. There's this story you told me a while ago. I don't know if it was apocryphal or real, or if you remember the details, but it was about the priest who said these really long masses, but he also struggled with like alcohol. Do you remember that? You mind telling that?
Yeah. It was from this really cool little magazine called Death to the World that I've been subscribed to. And it was like this Orthodox priest who would do his liturgies and services, but he would do the prayers for the dead, the oblations. He would do really long ones. He'd pray for like 150 people who had passed. And it was just like exceedingly long services. But the dude was also like an alcoholic. he struggled with addiction to alcohol, and it got so bad. He was otherwise a great priest and people loved him, but this was just like this huge problem he had. And it got so bad. He was so like, he was drunk in the services sometimes, and he had like spilled part of the Eucharist, the actual wine. And he was like, he like licked it up off the floor because he was like drunk at the time. And so anyway, so he goes and sits in with the bishop, and the bishop is like, look, this is shameful. This is unbelievable. This is not, you cannot be a priest and behave like this. You're totally a slave to alcoholism, and you're desecrating the Eucharist because of it. And he was about to like basically take away his priesthood, and out of the walls were like faces and voices of the departed who were begging and pleading with this bishop, do not take away his priesthood. His prayers for us have been our relief, have been a salve for us. For our sake, do not take this away. And the bishop was like, this doesn't make any sense to me. This seems crazy, but okay, never touch alcohol again, and you can maintain your priesthood. And the guy was very like repentant and apologetic. He was not like stubborn about it or anything, but the story goes from that day on, he never had another drip of alcohol, and he went back to the priesthood.
That story captures something for me. We'll have to map it back on to the kind of the original observation you made. But what it captures for me is one of the sobering realities of local parish life. When you think about Christianity in the abstract, it's so promising. It's so exciting. The possibility of sanctification, the possibility of changing the world, the possibility of being used by God to redeem the world. And
if
the possibility
only I could just attend the church that I've constructed in my mind out of Christian principles and theology.
Yeah, right. And then you participate in parishes, and the way we serve the world is through serving people, right? And you find that these parishes are held together by a small group of people who are willing to show up. And you find that maybe the most talented or the most erudite or whatever person who could be doing this or that job, they're irrelevant to the discussion because they don't show up. Or they do show up, but they show up more with a consumer mindset, you know, give me my sacraments and I go home, or like, hey, there's nothing really cool going on here. I'm going to go someplace else that's got more options for me.
Okay, now I got to ask you about a story that, didn't you tell me about some parish somewhere where there was a guy who like never would say anything that indicated he was moved at all by Christianity, or like, wasn't that a beautiful homily, or, oh, thank you, Lord, or kind of like just rude and grumpy and to the point, but like would just raise money for the poor like a beast. And just like when it came to actually, you know, when you think about the parable, like the son who says, sure, I'll go out there and work the vineyards, but never does. And the one who says, no, I'm not going to work the vineyards, you jerk, but then does. The second one is favored more in the eyes of God. He actually did it.
Yeah, this is a guy who you might not, if you have a conversation with him every day for a week, you might not walk away with any knowledge as to whether or not this guy prays. You'll have to explicitly ask him. But if the church were ever in a crisis and it needed $5,000 to keep the lights on, I'm not picking anyone above this guy, because he will care. He will take it personally. He will treat it like it's his job to do that, and like God called him to do it, and he will just go get it, and he won't have any difficulty with it. And it's not to say that that justifies the flaws or makes the flaws non-existent, but it's easy to look out at the world and say, well, it ought to be this way, it ought to be that way. And it's much harder to kind of look within and say, well, what role should I play in making it that way? Yeah, the church needs more help. Yeah, there should be more small groups. Yeah, there should be more Bible studies. Yeah, they ought to do something more than just have dinners. Yeah, they ought to do something more than just have beer. Yeah, they ought to. But what role am I playing in help bringing that about? And then that becomes tough, because once I ask that question, I'm like, oh, well, I'm busy on Wednesday nights. I really can't do anything Tuesday nights. And like Thursdays, I promised my wife to do this. And like Friday, I'm tired. I needed my day off. And it's like, oh, okay. So the person who's going to be teaching the class is the person that's available to do that. And when you're available, you let us know, right? And so all of these types of problems, I try to resist my instincts to focus on the externals, and I try to look at them through those eyes and ask myself, well, what am I to do about that? What's my role in doing something about that? And the first thing that comes to my mind is, well, no one is drawn to Jesus except through the Holy Spirit, period. The devil ain't drawing anybody to Jesus. He'll interfere with the process. He'll add in a bunch of lies to keep the process from going smoothly. But when a heart opens up enough to say, I am interested in Jesus, whatever might go wrong in that process, that doesn't happen unless the Holy Spirit turns on the lights. And so whenever that's happening, the first thing we do is we celebrate that. And we allow that to increase our faith and say, whoa, all of the prayers of the faithful that are said day in and day out with no visible results, with no evidence of anything happening, there is something happening, and we better keep it going. Let's use this as motivation to intensify our prayer efforts, right? I think that's the first response. And that by itself just changes the game. Then I think the second response to that is to say, all right, I'm never going to stop the grift. Never. No matter what it is I do, there are always going to be people presenting themselves in the marketplace of ideas with something that they're selling that's inconsistent with the truth, right? It's kind of like, for instance, with all the apparition sites, or all the sites where miracles have been witnessed, or any site that has been deemed to be sacred for any reason whatsoever. A saint lived here, a saint died here. There's always going to be somebody who gets the idea of like, oh, let me go get a little cart of something and set up shop a mile away from the site, or as close as I could get, so I could sell people the t-shirts, the hats, the hot dogs, because there's going to be a lot of traffic over here, and I want to gamify it. You can fight it, you can be mad about it, but at the end of the day, you're not going to stop that kind of grifting from happening. But where you combat it is in the same arena as where you combat evil. You say, how can I be the light as purely as I can be? And how can I be an ambassador for the light as good as I can? And what does that demand of me in terms of my prayer life, in terms of my study life, in terms of my family life, which is one of the highest devotional expressions of our relationship to God, the faithfulness in those little things. And I think through the net of our own cooperation with God, we catch some of that traffic. We may not catch 1,000 people on a podcast, but we catch the 3 or the 30 people that are in our sphere of influence who come to us and say, hey, Isaac, man, I'm interested in this Christianity thing. I know you've been at this for a while and know a little something about it. And you can kind of catch people in that.
Or like Isaiah's remnant, you never even know that they're listening. You never even get the pleasure of knowing that you impacted them, but you did. There, Saint something of something said, I can't remember his name, where he's from. He said, work out your own salvation and thousands will be saved, or 1,000 will be saved because of it. Yeah. And just kind of this idea, like, first just focus, right? Remove the plank from your own eye. So I was thinking as you were talking, I had actually never had this thought before about, you see a big name, a Russell Brand or a Kanye West or whatever, like say, hey, I'm a Christian now, I got saved. And it's easy to be like, well, you'll know them by their fruit. So I'm going to kind of sit back with my arms crossed and watch and see if that was a real salvation. Because if it was a real salvation, they won't go back to doing the stuff they used to do. And this idea that like our job as Christians, when someone who was enslaved to the devil becomes saved, is to sit back and wait and see if they can stay saved, right? If they can stay living there. And then they're like, wait before we risk our reputation by associating with them. And I was thinking about the parable of the prodigal son. I almost said like Michael Scott, the prodigal son. It's easy for us to see that as like a one-time thing. He went out, he made bad decisions, lived a bad life, rejected his birthright, came back and said, I beg forgiveness. And his father was merciful and generous and forgave him. It's a one-time thing. It's done. God, the Trinity, exists outside of time. So all of these things are perpetual, right? They are perpetually happening. We are perpetually being forgiven and welcomed back for our perpetual failability. And you think about that as like, put it in a realistic context. The older son, that son comes back. This is a son who impetuously said, give me all the money, let me go party, spent years out there living this way, hits rock bottom, realizes they're at rock bottom, comes back and begs forgiveness and meant it at the time, gets forgiven. In real life, you know people like this. In real life, what do they do with that forgiveness? What do they do with the generosity shown to them? Do they never mess up again? No, they have years of bad habits. They go do the same freaking thing. They say, whoo, dad's forgiving me. I got more money now. I'm going to go on another bender. And they hit rock bottom again. And they come back again and say, all right, I messed up again. I'm going to need a little more forgiveness. I'm going to need a little more help. Like, it's not just like, that's the pattern. And the job of the older sibling is not to despise them or not to wait and see if it's real. Yeah, let's see if you can stay, out of the party life. I'll bet you go do it again. It's to help them. They come back and ask forgiveness and say, I made mistakes. Now help them avoid falling into it again. Say, all right, I embrace you, brother. I'm here. Our Father's forgiven you. So do I. Let's work hard on building new habits. Because right now, you clean the house, it's going to get filled up with new demons as soon as it's clean, unless you fill it with something good. Right. So let me help you. Let me help you develop better habits, because you're going to get pulled back in. And like, that's the part that I feel like is missing. There's this cynicism about, prove to me you're a real Christian. The minute somebody says anything indicating any desire to be forgiven, to become a Christian, come alongside them and say, let me help you, because it's only going to get harder from here. Yes, you're forgiven. Yes, you were baptized. Guess what's going to happen? The house has been swept clean. The demon's going to come back with 7 friends. We got to be ready. We got to fill you with good stuff. We got to help you. I know you're going to struggle again. You ever dealt with anyone who's got any kind of addiction? It usually is not just they hit rock bottom and then they're good and they never do it again. It's like, it's constant. It comes in waves, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And so I just sort of like think about what happened after that moment in the prodigal son. The most likely story is the pattern repeated, but hopefully in smaller and smaller ways. And hopefully there was help to get through that, so that when each wave of temptation came, it became easier and easier to resist and say no to that.
That's powerful, man. I'll add 2 things onto this. So the culture we find ourselves in now places such a premium on changing the world through talking, through expressing our opinions, that we now overvalue the impact of a tweet, the impact of a publicly expressed emotion, more than a lot of the close yourself up in a closet and pray kinds of actions that for most of the history of the church has produced impact in the world. And the fact of the matter is, if you put up a tweet calling someone out or whatever it may be, even if you get 1 million impressions, I simply can't know what that does. I don't know what those impressions mean. Maybe people think this is interesting. Maybe the algorithm has rewarded you with the level of exposure that you don't deserve and that isn't really reflective of how much people value it. Maybe everybody who liked it or responded to it completely forgot about what you wrote about within 48 hours. Who knows? I don't hate on the tweets, but I just don't even know what they mean. So because we place such a premium on that, we often believe that we're not doing our job if we're not always expressing our opinion about every single thing that is being discussed. And so when it comes to someone like the salvation of Russell Brand, I don't even know anything about his story. I'm mildly aware that he, claims to be a Christian or something like that. But guess what? I'm totally free from having to have an opinion about his status. It would be like someone coming to me and saying, hey, do you believe that Marilyn Monroe is in hell? What's my answer to that? Man, I don't know where Marilyn Monroe is. I have no idea where she is. And I don't need to have an opinion about that. I can tell you what I think I've seen, but I really never kept up with her life and legacy and what she was like in old age. I don't know, man. But let's talk about something that I do know. Let's talk about something that's more important to me, that's within the realm of what I can control. And so it's okay to not have an opinion on everything. And in the world of reaction videos and reactions to reactions, you really do got to feel now like you got an opinion about everything. So that's an example of this. There's a Catholic apologist, Joe Heschmeyer, And we all know the infamous James White, who has been debating Catholics for like the past, I don't know, 20 years.
I don't even know him.
You don't even know who James White is?
You try to throw me under the bus.
but
everybody with half a brain cell knows. Oh, Isaac, you've never heard of him.
I thought you know who James White is. But we grew up in such different homes. I grew up in a home where, you know, my mom had all the preachers and people playing on the radio. Bible.
You saying my mom was a pagan? You throwing my mom under the bus now?
But man, your mom grew up Catholic, man. So
you gotta be careful about them Catholics.
She probably went into the Bible.
Talk about being 10 years early. My mom was like 50 years early. You know what I mean? On that Catholic thing. So James White, he's been debating this Catholic dude.
Yeah. And so they have this debate. And in this debate, James White makes an aside where he seems to be questioning whether or not we can rely on the writings of I believe it's Ignatius. And everybody has memed it since. Like, oh, you must be really desperate. You're going that route, right? And it's like everybody's got a reaction video for that moment, clipping that. And it starts to feel like, oh, well, as someone who has a stake in this discussion, I need to have an opinion about this. I need to take a look at this for myself and see where I stand on the reference of James White in this moment and decide who won this debate. Or I can just keep doing what I'm doing. I can keep serving my family. I can keep working out my own salvation with fear and trembling. We don't need to have an opinion about as many things as we think we do. But here's the second most important thing, and that is this idea of being a fruit inspector, this idea of like, well, we'll see. Let's see what fruit comes from the tree. That's an attitude that can work both ways. And it's an attitude which must always be directed towards myself first. Mm-hmm. And so if we take someone like Russell Brand and we ask the fruit question, I can ask the question of, hey, well, what kind of fruit is Russell Brand producing? But then I can also ask myself, hey, what kind of fruit am I producing in relation to ensuring that he does get to heaven? I'm expressing a lot of opinions about Russell, but how much do I pray for him? Because I believe that for me, the pressure is real, that I better be praying for a man 10 times as much as I criticize him. Because if I'm criticizing him without asking God to deliver him from whatever it is I'm criticizing him for, what kind of fruit is that in my life?
You know, it's funny too, because Russell Brand, being a famous guy, you are his neighbor. His neighbor is anyone who feels like they know him or lives adjacent to him. And because he has a huge fear of influence and notoriety, anyone who's heard of him or followed him at all is sort of his neighbor, right? And so we're all judging his fruit as his neighbor. When you say, what's my fruit? It's like, oh, well, if the people who listen to this podcast or read my tweets, you know, they'll say that I have good fruit. No. Who is my neighbor? Literally, my physical neighbors in Bradenton, Florida. If I died tomorrow, would any of the houses that live nearby even know that I was a Christian?
And if they don't know, do they have a better chance of knowing Jesus because of the way I went to bat for them in unseen ways?
Right. Is there any way that I have made it? Like, that's a harder question. In today's world, that's a scarier. If you're like, have I made a positive impact? And I'm thinking about the tweets that I've sent into the ether that I imagine, I can see numbers that show impressions. Okay, well, I have like signaled positive values that I stand for to some number that is theoretically people somewhere. What about the actual human beings that I see every day I take my garbage down to the curb? Have I done anything positive for them? Would they know me by my fruit? Would they know I was a Christian by my love? Like, that is a really convicting. It's funny too, when you were talking about the feeling that you need to take a stance on any of the sort of debates or issues of the day. Pretty much all the times that Jesus was confronted by religious leaders, you know, and when we read it, it's hard to necessarily know this right away, but when you start to study more, you realize almost all the questions they asked him, they were trying to get him to pick a side on a currently polarizing issue of the day. So what happens, you know, who are you? if you've married multiple people, what happens at the resurrection? They were trying to get him to stake a claim on a vigorous debate within the religious community about whether or not there's a bodily resurrection. They're trying to get him to stake a claim on whether or not are you violating your religion to pay taxes to Caesar. These were polarizing debates in the current moment. And every time his answer was like so confusing and subversive, it just sort of went above. It went a layer higher and was like, that's not the level on which this debate matters. I'm not picking right or left side. I'm going to something higher or something deeper, if you will, more fundamental. And it like baffled them and left them frustrated because they really wanted him to pick a side. And I think Jesus' example of just being cautious when someone is clearly angling, and it says sometimes Jesus knew what they were up to, right? He knew what they were trying to do. When someone's trying to force you, and it doesn't have to be a specific person, but the culture, the feed, the algorithm, you feel this pressure to pick a side. There's two sides presented to you. As a Christian, which side do you take? You're going to speak on behalf of all Christians now. What do Christians think? What do they say? And you feel this pressure that's usually always a trap. And like, look at the example of Jesus of like avoiding that trap and going for something deeper, you know, like, should we stone this woman? Should we not stone this woman? Yeah. Okay, go ahead. Stone her. Oh, if you are without sin, right? It's always like this crazy, unexpected, and just trying to learn that. One other thought. I know I'm like splurging all over the place.
It's good. Yeah.
There's this tendency. I think I maybe talked about this with Cyprian, but when somebody who's a big name who has an audience becomes a Christian or says they become a Christian, we have this tendency to like judge by their fruit. We assume that means that the fruit of that naturally would be they keep doing all the things they did when they were not a Christian, but now they just do it in a Christian way. So like Lauryn Hill says she's become a Christian, and then she disappears from the music scene. And as Christians, our instinctive reaction is to feel disappointed by that.
Right. You need a Christian album now.
Like, what are you doing? You have such a fan base and audience. You could do so much for the kingdom of God. But for all I know, her dropping off the public map and going in her prayer closet every day, I don't know if she's doing it, but let's just imagine that she is. That could be doing more for the world than what I wish that she was doing. And that could be keeping her safe from getting pulled back under by the devil from what I wish she was doing. So like, there's also this set of assumptions about what the fruit would look like. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because I can't see the fruit doesn't mean it's not there. I might just be ignorant and selfish and blinded by my own assumptions.
Yeah. You know, with that kind of example in particular of a popular person or a celebrity person disappearing rather than using their influence for God, it's a reminder that our first duty is to do that which is necessary for our own sanctification. And we all have to be honest with ourselves about, hey, where do I need to be? Kind of like the alcoholic who says, maybe you can go into a bar and have a good time. I can't go into that space and be who I know I need to be for my family. And sometimes those little things that we do can just go a lot further for impacting the world for God than like kind of following what other Christians think we need to do, you know?
Yeah. It's such an interesting dichotomy. The things that people can do to advance the church or the kingdom of God versus the way that we experience those people in our life. Like you were talking about in your local parish, people can be really annoying and really frustrating and have a bunch of very immature foibles, but they still might be very valuable members of the church, the kingdom of God. I remember my wife's great grandma Josephine, God bless her soul. She was 99 when she died,
Wow.
Little old woman. And by the end, she like literally had dementia, was a little crazy, but even throughout for like the last 30 years of her life was a very difficult woman for her family to deal with, to help, to take care of. Very frustrating, very like in all the surfacey ways that just make you annoyed. But this woman was, for as goofy as she was in some ways, was an amazing prayer warrior. She had this humongous list. I remember I was a kid and my mom, I knew her before I even knew my wife. We were visiting her once and she had this list on the wall and it was like Metallica, Led Zeppelin, all these like popular bands. And I was like, what is that? I was probably like 8 or 9. And she said, "Oh, my grandson, I asked him for all the music he listens to because I knew it wasn't good. And I wanted all the names of the band so I could pray for them every day." And she did. Like, she would just pray. She would pray for everyone. She had lists and lists and lists. And she would just pray. She was a prayer warrior, like a
Wow.
frustrating person in the day-to-day fleshly realm, right? But like, who knows what this woman was doing in her intercession? You know what I mean? And I think there's so much of that we don't see going on around us.
Hey, two things. One, it's also who knows what ways in which God was preparing her for heaven by allowing her to spend a portion of her life being incredibly difficult to other people. You know, one of our most precious possessions is the sense of independence that allows us to not be a difficulty to others. And man, there is nothing more humbling than knowing that you are making everybody's lives harder and you can't do anything about it. I have to allow myself to be taken care of. I mean, that is sanctification at one of the highest levels. And so who knows what her life of prayer brought to her own spiritual journey for that final stage of, purification, if you will. The other thing is sometimes messages about how you don't need money, you don't need to be famous. So you already know where I'm going. It sounds like the things we need to say to ourselves to feel better about not being what we really want to be, which is like rich and famous. Like, you and I both know when it really comes down to it, man. If we could do
the guy who's like, I'm just into jazz music for the love, is also super bitter every time a pop star wins a Grammy.
Yeah, right. And even a lot of I think there's some healthy pushback against Hollywood celebrity culture, especially because they've been forced down our throats so much as like the people that know what they're talking about. And people are just over that now, and people see through that. But there's also this other side to it that we got to be careful about. Some of the hatred for celebrities, the inability to tolerate the very mention of them, comes from a place of still buying into the lie that they are the ones that have the power. And we hate them because we believe they are the really powerful ones, and we don't like the way they're using their power. And we believe that if we can just get Tom Hanks or, freaking Kendrick Lamar to push our agenda, then we'd really change the world. But these guys are singing and making movies about things that don't support our agenda, and it's upsetting to us. And so we still think they're the ones that have the real power. But I don't look at this as a consolation prize, and I don't look at it as saying that stuff doesn't matter. That kind of influence is real, but it's remembering that influence comes not from the possession or the absence of it. Influence comes from what the Spirit of God chooses to do with that situation. And, it's not in the water or the wine. It's what's offered to Jesus. And I think about this old statement. I believe it was Dr. Tim McGrew who said this to me. He said that if God has called you to be a king, don't stoop to the level of being a pauper. But also, if God has called you to be a pauper, don't stoop to the level of being a king.
Woo!
Yeah. It's not in your shout out to Tim McGrew.
I will bring it home on this, but I love what you said about celebrity. Maybe next time we'll have to have a more in-depth conversation about celebrity, because I know you've been around a lot of them. You've lived in LA. You've been, adjacent to that industry, in that industry. But it's you can see a celebrity walks into a coffee shop, let's say, and you've got the kind of embarrassing, fawning person who's just immediately starstruck. They're famous, therefore I'm just like instantly an idiot and like in this worshipful mode. Yeah, that seems a little silly and a little in excess. But then you also have I don't care. They're just another person to me. I don't give them. And that also seems phony, because certain people literally do have a magnetism, a charisma, a gravitas, whatever you want to call it. And really, the person who's like stubbornly insistent, like they actually have to work to like prove that they are unmoved and they don't care. And they're not going to look and do a double take or smile or ask for an autograph or be impressed when the person comes up and shakes their hand. Like they're fighting it. They're fighting their nature. That's equally kind of a type of embarrassment or debasement in a sense. And I think there's like an appropriate response that like sort of we should try to aspire to is, yes, this person has a certain gravitas. Yes, when they walked in the room, I don't even care about them in terms of I'm not a fan of their movies, but even I couldn't deny there was something attractive about them. And I immediately was like, whoa, they looked at me and shook my hand. Like, that's okay. And acknowledge that that is a attribute that they have, but that attribute is not a virtue in and of itself, nor is it a vice. It's just a thing. It's just like some people are really tall. Some people are really shy. Some people are super magnetic and charismatic and just all of a sudden make you wish that they would give you their attention when they walk in the room. That's okay, right? Like, I just like, there's just this weird tension that celebrity presents, but maybe that's a whole other topic.
Yeah, you just remind me of this time. My wife and I were walking along Manhattan Beach, and I could just there are two guys walking in our direction as we're going this way. And I could just see from a mile away. I don't even like look for them, but I could see from a mile away it's Vince Vaughn. And as he approaches,
by the way, isn't that funny? I was with my girls in New York one time, and there's tons of people walking by. And at 3 points during this 3-day trip, somebody was walking by from a distance. And before I could tell who they were, I knew they were famous. And then it was, who is that person? Why do I know they're famous? I got to figure out. Like, how did I know they were famous before I recognized who they were?
Yeah. I mean, he just had a presence, and there was no crowd around him. It was just him and a friend of his, and they're just walking, having a normal looking. Hey, that's what he did. I go, hey, Vince. And he goes, hey, what's up, buddy? How you doing, baby? It felt like he said, what's up, buddy? How you doing, baby? Good to see you. Take it easy, baby. In about 2 seconds. I can't even imitate it. What's up, buddy? How you doing, baby? Good to see you.
I'm also from Chicago.
Vince changed my life. Give me a hug. But it's a moment that goes by just like that. And you got to have a sense of humor about those moments. My wife and I looked at each other like, oh, that was so cool. That was so fun, right? We saw Vince Vaughn. And at the same time, you don't go home at night and go, I'm somebody. Vince said hi to me. You know, it's both extremes.
Yeah. It's funny. If you have kids, there's just an instinctive, like when my son, we watched the Meg 2, and I just mentioned, hey, see that character? That's Paige Kennedy. I know him. I'm on a fantasy football league with him, and we text all the time. And the look on his face, like, just because he saw him on this movie, like, you can't fight the human nature that's like, whoa, that's a big deal. So we actually did a FaceTime call with Paige Kennedy, and my son just thought it was like the coolest thing ever. Like, and rather than being like, son, you shouldn't be any more impressed with a celebrity than you are with someone, like, no, it's human. It's okay. But it's also not something to be worshipped. The best, we'll end here. The best celebrity story I've ever heard. I have no idea if this is apocryphal because I just saw it on, I think somebody tweeted a picture of a Reddit post that said this. So it could be completely made up, but I'm just choosing to believe that it's true. Happy Gilmore, one of the funniest movies ever. The villain in that movie, Shooter McGavin, like this super douchey golfer, like Shooter McGavin. Yeah. This dude was like
characters of all time.
This dude, and by the way, Shooter McGavin, the Twitter account, I have no idea if it's actually run by the actor, but is also hilarious. This dude was like, yeah, so I was at the airport with my buddy, and we see Christopher, his name's Christopher something. I can't remember his last name. Christopher, whatever, who played Shooter McGavin. And we both ran up and we were like, Shooter, oh my gosh, it's Shooter McGavin. And he was like, that was like 15 years ago. Get a life, you losers. And we both were kind of like, whoa. So we started to walk away. And then all of a sudden he walked a few steps and then turned around and said, Shooter, and did the little gun things. It was like, we thought he was being a jerk, but he was actually just being in character as Shooter. I hope that story is true.
Dude, I hope that story is true too. The
like,
world needs it.
Those actors who have that role, and like, you're like Jeff Daniels is like embarrassed that he ever played in Dumb and Dumber and tries to like downplay it. The ones who are like, no, the only thing I'm known for is being the villain in a stupid comedy, and I'm going to just be that guy for the next 15 years. Like, just own it, baby. Just own it. No shame. Give me something to sign off with, TK. What do you want? What do you want to tell the people? What are we going to end with?
Oh man, that was the story right there, man.
I mean, your LeBron to Cleveland prediction, is that where you want to just stake your reputation on?
I need a few things to happen, but it's more of a recommendation than a prediction.
Okay.
LeBron, if you're watching this, or if someone you know is watching,
definitely watching this.
100%.
No, LeBron is the type, because I occasionally insult him on Twitter. He probably is following me, and he's probably got some people that are going to try to, pay me to not insult him anymore. So
LeBron and KD are watching. Hey, LeBron, listen up, man. You can win 20 championships in LA, and you will never be to that city what they have already decided before you even got there what Magic and Kobe will be. One championship in Cleveland will be worth 1,000 championships in LA, and you already got that one. You want to end your career for a city that will goat you forever and that will go to death arguing for you? Go back to Cleveland. The time is right. All they got to do is lose the ship this year, and then you go save them and get them over the top, man, and close it out. It'd be a great NBA love story.
And imagine that picture of Bronny James, 0 minutes played, but he's front and center in that picture of holding up that finals trophy.
Bronny with a Cleveland Cavs
coming home. Hey man, this was a blast. We'll talk to you next time, TK.
All right, man. Keep it Bronny.